My name is Matt Phillips, and I am delighted and honored to be able to introduce to you today two of the leading lights of the intellectual movement. I have with me here David Friedman and Robert Murphy, and we'll be having a friendly discussion comparing and contrasting the Chicago and Austrian schools of economic thought and their impact on ethics and other social sciences. David Friedman, as probably most of you know, son of Milton Friedman and Rose Director, both intellectual giants of their own right of the Chicago School of Economics. David also got his PhD at the University of Chicago, but in physics. Does not call himself a macroeconomist, but has made major contributions to economic thought nonetheless. Robert Murphy is a scholar at the von Mises Institute and a well-known proponent of Austrian School of Economics. Work based on Mises, Menger, and Hayek. Also received his PhD in economics from New York University. Now works as a consultant, economic consultant. So the format of today's event, each of these gentlemen is going to have 10 minutes to present an overview of each of their schools of thought, and then we will have a 20-minute discussion, free form, after which we will do a 40 to 50-minute Q&A session from the audience, and then we will close with a 5-minute closing for each speaker. So without further ado, go ahead.
I should start by saying that various people have referred to this as a debate, and I'm not going to find out whether it's a debate for about another 15 or 20 minutes. Because in my experience, some people who call themselves Austrians define that in terms of ideas I disagree with, and some in terms of ideas I agree with, and until Bob tells me what he means by Austrian, I don't know which category he's in. So what I want to do is to talk about how I think economics ought to be done, and how I try to do it, and how I think other people, including some of the Chicago people I know, try to do economics. And it starts out with one very simple assumption, which economists refer to somewhat misleadingly as rationality. And the assumption is that the best way of understanding and predicting the behavior of other people is to assume that people have objectives and tend to take the actions that best achieve those objectives. That's the pattern in human behavior. It's clearly not a perfect description of human behavior. For example, one of my objectives is to keep my weight down, and yet I have observed that if there is a bowl of potato chips within arm's reach, it mysteriously empties itself. To some extent, I can compensate for my own imperfect rationality by not having bowls of potato chips within arm's reach, although sometimes other evil people subvert that plan. But with regard to other people, I don't know enough about them to try to do an improvement on the rationality assumption, and therefore it's a pretty good way of making sense of their behavior. Now, the problem, or a problem with this approach, is that it doesn't tell us enough. That there are two big gaps between the rationality assumption and actual conclusions of what people will do. The first is that we don't know what other people's objectives are. We know something about them by introspection because we're humans and by observation, but not enough. And the second is we don't know everything about how objectives can be achieved. So the result is that as far as I know, there is no single prediction about human behavior, nothing you could actually observe that can be made with certainty from economic theory. If all we have is the assumption of rationality, I don't think there is any statement of what people will do or won't do that we can be certain is true. And the way I made that point in my price theory textbook a long time ago was, why is that man standing on his head holding a burning $1,000 bill between his toes? because he wants to stand on his head holding a burning $1,000 bill between his toes. I have no way of proving that no human being has such bizarre objectives. So the way you improve on that is to use the theory to make plausible conjectures based on your best guess about people's objectives and how they can be achieved, and then to test those predictions against the real world and find out whether they actually work. And if they work, that's some evidence that the complications you've assumed away aren't essential, that you've gotten close enough to the right picture to get the right answer. And if the predictions are wrong, you can then go back and try to fix your theory. And that, in my view, is the basic mechanism of economics. There is a second reason for that methodology, which I discovered empirically when I wrote my first journal article. I wrote an article which was an economic theory of the size and shape of nations, which attempted to explain in a general way the pattern of the map of Europe from the fall of the Roman Empire to the present. And it started with a very simple puzzle that nobody else seemed to have noticed, which was, when the Roman Empire fell, why did it break? The Roman Empire was this enormous state covering a large part of Europe and the Mediterranean world. And if you looked at the world 500 years later, what you saw was a patchwork of little tiny baronies that were in effect practically independent states. Why did that happen? And I had a theory about that. And I wrote an article that I thought was a very good article. And I submitted it to the Journal of Political Economy. And the editor of the Journal of Political Economy at the time was George Stigler, who I had known since I was a small child because he was one of my father's best friends. And he rejected the article. And he rejected the article on the grounds that in order for my theory to be publishable, I had to have some empirical tests of it. And he had some suggestions, none of which worked. But I thought up ways that I could, in fact, test my theory. The critical fact was that I needed data going back about 1,500 years. But one form of data we have going back that far is the map of Europe, that you can look at a historical atlas that shows you where the boundaries are. And so I worked out, I thought, a fairly ingenious way in which I could get some predictions about what features the changes in the map of Europe should have had following from my theory, tested them, and on the whole they turned out to be correct. Somebody pointed out to me a further prediction that hadn't occurred to me, and that one turned out to be right too. And I resubmitted the article, and it was published. That was my first published journal article. I'm still rather proud of it for two reasons, at least. One of them is that a few years ago I came across a piece that was summarizing the literature on the size of nations. First article was mine. Second article, 10 years later, was by Jim Buchanan, who later got a Nobel Prize for some other work he did. And then there were some books by other people after that. And the second reason is that Donald McCloskey, who is now Deirdre McCloskey, somewhere commented that it was impossible to do quantitative historical work earlier than about the 18th century because the data wasn't there, and that the only exception he knew of was my article. So I was sort of proud of that. But I also learned something that I think was fairly important in the course of that activity, and that was that there is a second reason why you ought to try to test your theories, aside from finding out whether they were true. Because I would have to say, my tests weren't that good, all right? I got qualitatively the right answers, but it wouldn't astonish me if somebody later showed that there was a better theory of the size of nations. The more interesting thing was that in order to figure out how to test the theory, I had to think through much more clearly than I had exactly what the theory said. That as long as it was just sort of words on paper, I could be a little bit fuzzy about exactly what my claims were. When I had to say, what real-world predictions can I make with this theory and test, that forced me to think through much more carefully exactly what my theory was saying. So I concluded that the methodology that George Stigler had impressed upon me by rejecting my article, which I should say was a general policy of his journal, that as a general rule, I think he was not willing to publish theoretical articles unless they included some kind of an empirical test of the predictions of the theory. And the first lesson is that it's useful because it helps tell you if your theory is right, or more important, tell you if it's wrong. But the second lesson is that it is useful because forcing you to figure out what the predictions of your theory actually are results in your doing a better job of thinking through your theory. And that, I thought, was a very important lesson that I learned from that. Let me end with a few examples in order to reinforce my claim that economics doesn't tell us enough to make predictions with certainty. And I will list 3 predictions, 3 statements about the real world, all of which I think are true, and none of which, in any testable form, can be conclusively proved on pure theory alone. The first is the claim that a minimum wage law hurts the poor. One can construct hypothetical facts which could be true, under which a minimum wage law makes poor people better off. The second is the claim that tariffs make us worse off. Again, one can construct hypothetical circumstances that could be true, in which a tariff made America better off. And third is the claim that demand curves slope down, that if you raise the price of a good, people will buy less of it. One can imagine circumstances in which any of those 3 statements were false, and in order to be confident that they're true, you need to combine with the theory empirical evidence. That is the Chicago approach as I have learned it and tried to practice it. Thank you.
Testing? Okay.
He's taking the empirical approach already to whether the microphone.
I assumed a microphone. All right. Before I get started here, look, I don't want to be a spoilsport and complain, but in the opening bios, there was a bit of an asymmetry that you lavished praise upon his father. Didn't say a word about my parents. My dad's a really good golfer, and one time he played with Neil Diamond. So I just want to...
I just assumed that.
Yeah. Okay, so I think, yes, that this is going to be a debate in the sense I'm going to try to point out the areas in which we disagree. And one thing is that it's some of this may boil down to, and perhaps David will come back in the Q&A and clarify it this way. It might just be we're disagreeing over the difference between what an Austrian might call economic theory or law versus economic history. All right, so it's not that I'm going to try to say, oh no, axiomatically we have to prove what must have been the case determining the borders in Europe. That's not the position I'm going to take. What I would say is, when an Austrian says that, oh, you think economics should be deduced logically from the action axiom, for example, and I'll talk in a minute about what I mean by that, it's not that we're saying the sorts of claims he was talking about have to fall under that rubric. It's more that we're talking about the difference between economic principles or economic law versus applications of that set of tools about conjectures about what happened historically. So let me also just give a sort of caveat in the beginning here to make sure there's no misunderstanding. What I'm going to be representing, hopefully, is in terms of economic science and methodology, the position of Ludwig von Mises and the people who followed in that tradition, and that doesn't represent all self-described Austrians. There's people who liked Friedrich Hayek's work, and even Israel Kirzner also would not necessarily endorse the position I'm going to state here in this discussion. And then also I'm going to get into it, and Dr. Friedman didn't, but I think it was partly what we're supposed to do, and that's how it was billed in the description of this event. We're going to talk about not just economic method, but in terms of anarcho-capitalism, the justification, like why do we believe in that, if you will. And again, I think there's a big difference between Dr. Friedman's perspective and where I'm coming from. So on that issue, I would be in the tradition of Murray Rothbard more than some other self-described anarcho-capitalists. Okay, so let me just quickly run through where I'm coming from on economics in general, economic science, the difference between Austrians and the Chicago School. There's several things. Let me just mention a few, and then we're probably not going to come back to them because I think Dr. Friedman said he doesn't want to talk about business cycles and monetary theory, but if the point of this is to say what's the difference between the Austrians and the Chicago School, let me mention those just so you know. So one main difference is the Chicago School, the monetarists There's a whole body of thought about the proper conduct of monetary policy, which, we won't get into the details of that, whereas so it assumes that there is the government controlling the issue of the medium of exchange. So, of course, many Austrians dispute that whole enterprise and say that, no, just as with any other commodity, money and also banking should be flowing from the free market. And so that's one huge difference between a standard, what people would think of as the Chicago school versus the Austrians. Another thing is actually, it might surprise you, that Austrians had this reputation of being, diehard free marketeers and the market's always right thing, whereas like the Chicago school might be considered more nuanced. But in one respect, that it's actually not true, and that centers on this assumption of rationality. So there's this thing called the efficient markets hypothesis, the EMH, and there's different variants of that. There's stronger and weaker versions, but that's another big difference between the standard modern-day Austrian economist and standard Chicago school one. Just to give you a quick example, so Eugene Fama, who's an icon in the Chicago school tradition, after this interview happened, I think in like 2010, around there, people were asking him about the housing bubble, and what do you think about that? And he said, I don't even know what that term means. What do you mean by bubble? And he was saying that he didn't even, it's not only did he not think that there had just been a big boom or bubble in housing in the financial sector, he was saying, operationally, that term means nothing to me. And his argument was, hey, people are efficient. If people knew in real time we were in a bubble, defined by meaning assets were above what the price should be, well, then they would all sell the assets, right? Because you'd want to get out before the crash happened, but then that would end the bubble automatically. So he was saying, if you think through the logic of it, it doesn't really even make sense to say we're in a bubble, or to say, well, what about the people who predicted the housing crash? And Fama came back and said, well, they just got lucky, right? That there's plenty of people always at any given time saying the end is near, things are going to crash, and then if it does happen to happen, then in retrospect, those people look smart, but if there hadn't been a crash, we wouldn't be keeping tabs on their track record, right? So that's his approach there. So if you want to see more about that, I have an article called Bursting Fama's Bubble, and you can go Google, so you can tell what my perspective was on that, and you can go see more of what I'm talking about. But for our purposes here, I just want to note that the Austrians have no problem with the existence of irrational, in quotation marks, asset prices, and in fact, that's one of the hallmarks of Austrian theory, is to say how intervention in the credit markets, in particular when the central bank lowers interest rates artificially, that induces an unsustainable boom, and it can cause a so-called bubble in financial markets. And there were plenty of Austrians who had identified and said, yeah, this is unsustainable, we're in a bubble. So I'm just bringing that up because it might surprise you that there's a case where, in a sense, the Austrians are saying the traders on Wall Street are getting it wrong, and it's not that the market is always right in that sense. Okay, so that's one major difference. But now focusing on economic method, let me just give you an analogy, and then I think we'll get into more clash in the next segment of this discussion. But let me just give you a broad view of where I'm coming from. One analogy for what Ludwig von Mises' position is when it comes to economic method, because Mises says you just start with the axiom that humans act, meaning that they behave purposefully, that they have objectives they're trying to achieve and they choose means to attain them, and then you can deduce a bunch of consequences from that, or implications from that. And Mises thought that was the centerpiece of true economic theory, and then once you work out that toolbox deductively, just using introspection and reason, then you can apply it to particular historical events if you want to, but that would be economic history. And so a lot of people, on the face of it, that seems unscientific, right? Because a lot of people define a scientific statement as something that, at least in principle, is falsifiable. And there's lots of responses to that position, one of which is to say that position itself is not falsifiable, right? You can't go, how could you falsify the claim that to be scientific, a claim needs to be falsifiable? Okay, check a dictionary, all right. Well, we'll come back to that later. So that's one response. But in terms of economic theory, let me just give you an analogy of geometry. Okay, so in geometry, we go through and you learn stuff about, Pythagorean theorem and so on, and that's all done from axioms, and you deduce it logically. If a student in class said, well, let's go out and test to make sure that triangles or angles add up to 180, or to say, let's make sure that, given these assumptions, the hypotenuse adds up to what we think it should do, the teacher would have to explain, no, you're misunderstanding what geometry is. That's not how geometry works. Now, even though that's true, is it just we're spinning our wheels? Is geometry not telling us anything about the real world because it's just a bunch of definitions that we're manipulating a priori? I think we'd agree that no, you learn very counterintuitive things in geometry. All right, in mathematics in general, you build up results and you keep adding to it on, and we're not just wasting our time. It's not a pastime. It's not mental gymnastics. We think that helps us navigate in the real world as it exists out there because we've gone through these mental exercises. So it's the same thing with economic logic or laws or principles. Just thinking through some of these things actually does help us in the real world. It sheds light on objective reality, even though we're not going and testing those propositions. Let me just give you one other example of what I mean, and then I'll just quickly hit the anarcho-capitalism subject. If you open up an introductory textbook of economics, usually in the beginning they'll motivate it by saying, we want to teach you in this course how to think like an economist. And my claim is, go look at it, just about all of those propositions for what it means to think like an economist are not falsifiable things. They're not something you would go and test. Like they'll say things like, incentives matter. And that's a decision you're going to make on how you're going to view the world, is to say incentives matter. That's not something you would go and test. If I went up to somebody and said, hey, here's $10, cut your arm off, and he says, no thanks, I didn't just prove that incentives don't matter for that guy, right? It just meant that wasn't incentive enough for him to cut his arm off. If I offered him $1 million, he might do it, right? So that's what I mean. But the notion of incentives matter, that's clearly the way an economist thinks and approaches the world. And so all the things that are listed typically in what it means to think like an economist, those are not things you would go and test. Things like there's no such thing as a free lunch. We don't actually go out and test whether there are free lunches or not. What we do is we explain what do we mean by those words, and then it's just a way to get you to think. So in any situation, if you've been trained to think like an economist, your job is to identify, wait a minute, what's the not free lunch here? Right? What's the thing that people are missing? Okay. One last thing very quickly in terms of anarcho-capitalism and the justifications. So yesterday, Dr. Friedman gave a consequentialist approach. Somebody like Murray Rothbard would more justify it in terms of natural law derivation. And I would just observe that here I think, empirically, look at it empirically, the people who are most passionate about anarcho-capitalism, it's not because of a cost-benefit analysis or in terms of who's willing to pay more to whom. It's because they passionately believe in this is just, this is right. And the phrase "give me liberty or give me death" makes no sense if the reason for you believing in liberty is a pragmatic approach. Otherwise, you say "give me liberty or a sufficient side payment." You see what I'm saying? So that's what I'm saying is that again, it's I think a lot of people would just say yes, you could come up with the same answers perhaps a lot, but the reason we believe in this stuff is not because we think one side would bid more than the other. That's not why we, in our value system, endorse property rights and what we mean by these terms. Okay,
I think Bob's final comments are confusing economics with moral philosophy. Whether his view is right or wrong, it simply has nothing to do with Austrian economics, and I'm not at all sure that von Mises, who, as you may remember, at least in print, favored the draft, not to mention state opera, would have agreed with Murray's hardline natural rights position. I'm happy to argue against that position, but not in this discussion, because that's nothing to do with economics. I noticed that Bob did not take up my challenge to list any predictions at all that could be made with confidence on the grounds of theory. With regard to his point about the textbook, what he is talking about as thinking like an economist is precisely what I meant by the approach by which you form your conjectures. That is to say, it's a way of looking at the world which makes you gives you plausible guesses about what's true, but figuring out whether they're actually true about the real world requires some evidence. I was particularly struck by his mistake in physics, the fact that he apparently believes that the truth of Euclidean geometry can be known without empirical tests, whereas in fact one does not know without empirical tests whether or not the universe is flat. Think of the surface of a sphere. where plane geometry doesn't work. Add another dimension and you can get a three-dimensional model of the universe in which the angles of a triangle do not add up to 180 degrees, and in fact there are parts of the universe where it's true. So that's a rather nice example where you can form very plausible conjectures on the basis of an elegant system of pure theory called Euclidean geometry, but you need empirical tests to find out whether they are correct. Let me say a little bit about monetary theory, because I think Bob is making, again, a fairly serious mistake, not in economics, but in understanding Chicago school views. And I would like to refer to one of my favorite books, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Heinlein. Because some of you who know that book will remember the line by the protagonist, do business with the authority, do business with the law of gravity, too. That the reason Chicago school economists are interested in monetary systems run by governments is that the world happens to currently have monetary systems, almost all of which, with one exception all of you know, which didn't exist a few years ago, are run by governments. So it is not an issue of theoretically saying that governments should run monetary systems. I don't know if you've ever read my father's essay on the optimal quantity of money. But I pointed out to him many, many years ago that a competing system of private issuers would, to first approximation, give precisely the pattern of behavior that he described as the optimal behavior of the quantity of money, and as best I can recall, he agreed with me. That was not what he was writing about. It wasn't the world he was examining, and there's no particular reason that he should have been. So the monetary part is a red herring. The moral philosophy is a red herring. You took the very daring position of saying you were willing to agree with Murray Rothbard. And if I'd realized I was debating Murray Rothbard, I would have known it was going to be a debate. I'm curious as to whether you are willing to defend, since you like moral philosophy, Murray's view of fractional reserve banking, which comes down to the claim that making a contract with any chance at all that you will be unable to fulfill it is fraud. A doctrine on the basis of which essentially all contracts people make are fraudulent. Without that, you can't support, as far as I can tell, his view that fractional reserve banking is inherently fraudulent and therefore can be banned in a free society. That, again, is not economics. But you brought up Murray. He's not here for me to fight with, and I'm happy to have an alternative target. Let's see if there was anything else. Now, I guess my example had to do with the application of economics to the past, but the argument is a general one. That is, that in order to say anything useful, including have a theory that tells you whether housing prices are a bubble, you have to have a theory. You have to test that theory against the real world to figure out if it's right. Let me stop there and give you your turn.
Okay, so a few things. I'll go answer those and then we'll go back and forth and you just cut us off when we need to. So as far as mixing economic science and moral philosophy, yes, I did do that, but that's because that's what the description of today's event said it was going to be. So that's why I did that, and it's not that I'm mixing them up, but just we're talking about two separate things, and I purposely am not chewing gum so I can be able to handle those two things during this debate. So, yes, economic science is one thing, but what I'm saying is, why are we anarcho-capitalists? It's presumably because we think that's a better world that we want to live in. And so one major difference, again, that we were, at least my understanding was we're going to talk about in this debate, is the difference in motivation behind that. Why is it that one believes in that stuff? So that's why I went on that route. As far as, the saying, show me a prediction you can make with certainty. Well, yeah, I mean, I can in the sense of, if someone I predict that someone will choose that outcome that he most prefers, right? And you say, well, okay, but that doesn't tell me anything. That's just you're arguing in a circle. But the point is you could say the same thing about any sort of internally logical deductive system. And the point is that just to point that out doesn't reject it as therefore useless. All right, and let me go into the stuff with geometry. Right, I'm fully aware that there's an open question whether the universe out there physically conforms to Euclidean geometry. But the point is, geometry itself, so listen to what I said. I said when we teach geometry, you don't go out and tell people to go measure triangles and so forth. That's not what geometry is. What geometry is, you give the axioms and then you deduce it logically. So strictly speaking, what that means is what you're testing is, are the axioms correct? So the same thing is true with the Misesian approach to economics. What you would say is, okay, for any of this to be applicable to the real world, do we want to assume that the action axiom is true, right? Because that could be an open question. So you might not find it compelling to decide, I want to interpret the world as people behaving with goals and intentions, right? Because there are some strict behaviorists, for example, that think that's an illusion. They don't, so in other words, to see this glob of cells, moving and so forth, they would interpret that with the laws of physics or some other thing in terms of conditioned reflexes, rather than saying, I think there's an intelligence in there that thinks I'm sputtering nonsense right now, right? That's one explanation for the vibration of the vocal cords and so on. Another thing is just to say, well, given the state of the system at T1, blah, 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 this is what's going to come out at T2. And I just think that's not a very useful enterprise. All right? There's lots of reasons. Just again, to give you more reading, if you go and Google, I have an article called Mises' Non-Trivial Insight, and I get into this stuff more, but there's a big reason that the methods of the natural sciences don't work very well when it comes to the social sciences. One obvious thing is there's not reproducible experiments in the social sciences the way there is in many of the natural, and also we have this insight. You know what it is to be a rational being that has goals and to try to achieve them, and so that's why you adopt that approach when you're interpreting the behavior of these other things in the room that you consider to be intentional beings, right? When you're looking at a rock and its behavior, you don't think, oh, the rock went down because it wanted to get closer to the ground. That doesn't seem to be a very useful approach, but it does seem very useful when it comes to interpreting the behavior of these globs of cells to say there is an intelligence in there that has goals, and that's a very useful enterprise that we use in all the social sciences. As far as monetary theory in the Chicago school, I mean, if you can come back, if you're saying that most Chicago school economists want to end the Fed, I think empirically that's not true. And again, this is awkward to be like arguing about his dad because I don't want him to bring like my mom into it or something. But I mean, I don't know. I think I've read that essay. I know at one point your dad wrote that, well, the gold standard worked for a while, but the problem is if the government has an emergency, like needs to go into a big war, well then, that would be a constraint. So again, that's one, whether that's a good thing to say or not, the point is a lot of Austrians would disagree with that and say one reason not to have government intervention is that it allows them to enter a war. Right, so we're not disagreeing on the objective economics of it in that respect, but there is a difference as to how you view things. And I get just in terms of the influence on the public policy debate and so forth, I don't think it's correct to say the Chicago School and the Austrians have the same basic view on the desirability of government intervention when it comes to money. As far as fractional reserve banking, I'm not going to go to the barricades over that one. I don't necessarily think it's fraudulent. I would say economically that I think fractional reserve banking sows the boom bust cycle. But no, I don't care about whether to say is it technically fraudulent if everyone knows what's going on. That's not something I would get into. Okay.
Yeah.
You can just hold the applause, I think, until the end. Thanks.
Let me respond to a couple of things. First, I agree that working out a logical system from axioms can be useful. That's what I was describing as the approach you use to form your conjectures. The argument is about whether, having done that, you can then actually make predictions about the real world with confidence, or whether you can make plausible guesses that have to be tested against the evidence. This does not depend on whether the axioms are correct. That's an interesting question, and for people who would like to see the most interesting challenge I know of to the rationality assumption, there is a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, who is a psychologist who got a Nobel Prize in economics, and I think deserved it. And what he had done was quite a lot of research on what kinds of mistakes people make and explaining why. So in that sense, it was a theory of irrationality. It's a fascinating book, but that would be another talk. But suppose the axioms are right. Suppose that my rationality or Mises's human action is purpose of behavior, which are close to the same assumption, is true. That still doesn't get you far enough. Because since we don't know by introspection or observation exactly what people's objectives are, we don't know exactly what the facts of the real worlds are that determine what actions have what consequences. Even if you knew your actions are true with certainty, you still couldn't predict anything with confidence. You could still make plausible conjectures that depend on guesses about which complications you can assume away and which ones are essential, and so you still have to test those. A brief and not very relevant digression, it turns out that one way of stating classical physics as was done in the 19th century does treat objects as having objectives, that is one way of thinking about it that turns out to be useful, but not too irrelevant to here. What else? As far as I know, I am the only Chicago School economist who has published on the question of whether or not there should be private money issuers, and I'm in favor of it. From the standpoint of the rest, it wasn't, and have been in favor of it for quite a long time. I made that argument a long time ago. So the fact that Chicago School economists were not arguing for abolishing the Fed, they weren't arguing as far as my father was in favor eventually of abolishing drug laws, but that wasn't really a part of what Chicago School was or wasn't. Similarly for the Fed, I think as far as I can tell, my father's opinion was that the world was a worse place as a result of the existence of the Fed. That was really the implication of the work done in monetary history of the United States, that the Fed had been created to solve certain problems, and when the problems arose, it made them worse instead of better. But the question of private money wasn't really a question that was being much discussed. Let me see. What have I left out? I'm delighted to see that you are unwilling to defend one of Murray's incorrect positions. Let me offer a hypothesis about human behavior, which is that the reason for that position was that he wanted to believe both that bad consequences in the market were caused by fractional reserve banking, and that a morally just society would have no such bad consequences. And he therefore needed to fudge up a moral argument for why you could ban fractional reserve banking. Let me make one point, though, which is relevant to part of the reason I don't do macroeconomics. I like to say that a course in macro is a tour of either a cemetery or a construction site. Because unlike price theory, we don't really have very clear answers in that field. And part of the reason is that ultimately macro is a theory of disequilibrium, and macro, I believe, in the Austrian version as well as the various Chicago versions, depends on assuming people are making mistakes. So that it depends in some sense on a rejection of both my and Mises' assumption in order to explain it. Because it's all very well for the Austrians to say that some manipulation by the government causes artificially low interest rates. But their argument goes on to assume that actors in the economy will treat those as if they're a long-run prediction, when the actors, having read Austrian economics and being rational people, should know that the interest rate's going to go back up, therefore the optimal length of time for investment is going to change, therefore the mistakes, which as I understand from my very superficial knowledge of Austrian macro, explain the unemployment results, the bad consequences of business cycles, I believe depend in Austrian, as in other forms of economics, on rational actors making mistakes. And I don't, maybe you can show a version where that isn't true. It would be nice if we understood that. I don't understand it very well. I find price theory, which is working out the implications of rational behavior, to be an elegant, coherent model, which is very useful in making sense of the world, and maybe somebody will come up eventually with an equally good theory of macro, but I haven't seen it yet. One last point on reproducible experiments. It's not clear you don't have any of them, because they're natural experiments. But in fact, we now have the technology with which we can do real controlled scientific experiments in the social sciences. If you don't believe me, take a look at World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft is a whole bunch of more or less identical worlds, each server. And in principle, it would be possible for somebody playing the game to put a character on each of 100 servers. On 50 of them do X, and on 50 of them do Y, and then do statistics on the results in those little worlds. So virtual reality is actually beginning to give us the ability to do something rather like the controlled experiment. And of course, lots of natural science manages without controlled experiments. Astronomy, for example, it's even harder to do controlled experiments in astronomy than in economics.
Okay, so I'm going to keep this brief to turn over to your guys' questions. Okay, I think the main point of clash here is this issue about what he just ended with, conjections, falsifiable predictions, and so on. So let me just state my position again. I'm saying that in economics, the important thing for economists to get across to the public is not something that we know because we've gone out and run econometric time series analyses. It's things that we would convey to the public by using cute little thought experiments or just logical ways of reasoning. So like with free trade, the standard, and I think it's crucial that economists get that across to the general public, because there's a lot, it's very easy to think, if the government needs to put in a tariff to create jobs domestically. It's hard to get people to stop thinking like that. And in free trade is one of the things that it's very, economists have 19 different ways to show what we mean by the case for free trade, and yet it's hard to get that across to even an undergrad. And again, the way you do it is through appeals to get people to think through the implications of what they're saying. It's not to go look at studies to show, this country, lowered tariffs in this year and then this followed and so forth. There are such studies, and you could make a case that way, but there's so many moving parts that wouldn't be definitive. To get someone to really see, now I see the problem with thinking I want to create jobs for Americans and therefore we got to keep out cheap Japanese cars. The way to get someone to have an aha moment is not to appeal to statistics. All right, it's to appeal to the logic of the point. And it's true, you could quibble with the arguments and so on, but I'm saying in terms of what economists, what do they bring to the table in terms of what does economics know about the world, it's that sort of thing. That's what's crucial to get across. Just to show you why, look at the arguments that the Austrians typically have with the Keynesians over economic policy right now. If this were just a matter of, appealing to the data and saying, well, what can we reject with 95% confidence and that sort of thing, we're still arguing over what happened in the Great Depression. We still have diametrically opposed views as to whether the Obama stimulus package was good or bad. And I'm just saying that, to me, shows the weakness of trying to use that approach when it comes to economic policy. As far as Austrian business cycle theory and error and rationality, I think there is a difference in how Dr. Friedman's using the term rationality and what Mises means by that. And that when Mises says action is rational behavior, it doesn't mean that it's going to lead to the correct outcome, right? So if somebody, a few hundred years ago, if they had a patient and they said, we have to get the person sick and we have to get the evil spirits out by bleeding him or by, puncturing a hole in his head, that would be rational behavior in the sense Mises means it, because they're using means to achieve an end. And that to understand that, you have to know what's going on in the mind of that physician, and that's a different approach than to try to explain natural phenomena by reference to the laws of nature. All right, so Mises, it does not mean that people are supercomputers or that they're good calculators. That's not at all what the Austrians mean by that. And the last point I'll make with regard to business cycle theory, you can explain that even if everybody knows Austrian business cycle theory, you can still get the problem of an unsustainable boom because market prices serve a function. Right, and that's one of the central Austrian contributions, is to talk about the role of the use of knowledge in society and how it is in a market economy. There's dispersed bits of knowledge all around, and the price system is like a communication network. And so if the government comes in and messes up one of those key prices, namely the interest rate, that's going to distort things. That's going to cause a problem. Just like if there's a natural disaster and the government bans the use of walkie-talkies, that's going to mess things up. Even if everyone's aware that there is a ban, that still hinders the response to it. So it's the same thing in economics, that the interest rate serves a function that helps people coordinate savings and investment decisions. And if that is 25 basis points when really it ought to be 3.7%, that's going to mess things up.
Okay, we're going to take some of questions from the audience now. There's going to be a microphone right in the middle here, the aisle. And if you would also please make sure to speak directly into the microphone so that we can pick it up on the video. And also, after about maybe half an hour of questions, we're going to turn back and give each speaker another 5 minutes just to close, just to wrap up and conclude.
All right. Okay, this works. So I was very interested by a comment that Bob Murphy made, which was, well, in the social sciences we often can't check. And the thing about that struck me as interesting is the underlying assumption that the social sciences are therefore necessarily okay without being able to check. And I would actually argue that to the extent that the social sciences have been unable to make use of the tools from the hard sciences, that is the reason that the social sciences are so crappy by comparison to the hard sciences. We've had several millennia now of doing the natural experiment of pure deduction versus a combination of deduction and induction. And Aristotle claimed, for example, a lot of things about physics using pure deduction that all turned out to be incorrect, kept back knowledge for quite a while. And then people started experimenting, playing with things, and doing cycles of generate hypotheses, test, generate hypotheses, test. And as a result of that, we now know things, for example, like that no one would have expected, like that the geometry of space, in fact, around you right now is non-Euclidean. And in fact, if your geometry teacher was not an asshole and said to the little kids, please go out and measure, check for yourself, if they had sufficiently strong and powerful instruments, they would have found out something really valuable. And even if they didn't have very strong instruments, I think they still would have learned something very valuable, which is that, that at least in approximation, it looks like Euclidean geometry sort of works around us. There's all sorts of crap in the social sciences, and it survives, and people don't answer disputes. They're dueling schools of thought precisely because we can't conduct experiment. The fact that this discussion is even happening, there are no dueling schools of thought in physics, okay? There aren't the defenders of the caloric versus the defenders of thermodynamics who have debates, because we have ways to settle that. And to the extent that you cannot settle your disputes by going out and experimenting, that's not evidence that economics survives well without it. That is evidence of a flaw in economics and social sciences.
Okay. I don't know if that was a question or not.
Yeah, you raise your voice at the end.
Of course it was. Didn't you see the question mark at the end?
Okay, let me respond briefly. Okay, as far as the geometry stuff, I mean, that sounded great and everything, but I think you're bluffing. That's not true. It's not that you would want to...
I was not bluffing at all.
Okay, well then you're totally wrong. It is simply not true if you're teaching a 7th grader geometry and then you say on the test...
I've taught 7th graders geometry.
Okay, I think we get your point. Thanks. It's simply not true that when you're teaching geometry to junior high school students and you say on the test, okay, give me the proof of the Pythagorean theorem, and they say, well, if you went out and measured this and such, this is what you would get it marked wrong. That's not what geometry is. Now, it's true for a smart, advanced student. After the class is over, you can get philosophical and talk about, well, yeah, what's funny is, the actual universe may not be Euclidean, and you can talk about that stuff, but in terms of teaching someone geometry, and is it important as part of a well-rounded student to know what geometry is, that's the only point I'm making right there. And then as far as the reason economics is bad is because of the logical deductive method. See, again, this is the kind of thing where you have it both ways. The Austrians, on the one hand, are ridiculed for being these nut jobs off in the corner using their obsolete methods as opposed to what the mainstream has been doing, for decades. And then when the state of economic science is deficient, people blame it on the Austrians, right? You see what I'm saying? That's my whole point, that modern mainstream economics has been doing. They have embraced the methods of the natural science. Someone like Paul Samuelson lamented, I can't believe some people actually listen to this guy Mises when it comes to economic method. All right, so if you go to Harvard or MIT or any of these big schools in economics, Chicago, they're not going to use the logical deductive method. They're going to do exactly what you're saying economists should do. And you're right, the fact that we can't settle anything shows that that's not a very useful method in economics. And I would say what economists, the stuff that really is good is stuff that Bastiat and Say knew, and it's not because they went out and ran regressions, it's because they thought through the implications. If you want to, someone says, oh, why don't we have the government pay for health care and then everyone will be well? I mean, the first thing an economist is going to say is, well, wait a minute, that's going to take resources from somewhere else. And that's not an empirical claim, really. That's more of a think about what you're saying sort of claim. So that's the role that economists play, the useful role, as I would say.
I think economics, like many other sciences, involves a combination of theory and tests, and that in fact one can do tests of predictions, and one can modify one's theory on the basis of those tests. So economics does in fact know a good deal. Theory is useful. In particular, the question of free trade, the standard arguments Bob's talking about are arguments which are rebutting a theoretical argument. They are showing that the absolute advantage mercantilist view of trade is logically incoherent. That still leaves open the question of whether we're better off with tariffs, but it means that a particular reason for thinking we're better off with tariffs is simply wrong. It's a logical mistake.
As for price levels and such, do you subscribe to your father's view that a steady, stable price level is a general good thing? And how would you argue about, as technology gets better, prices generally decrease if the economy grows faster than the money supply? And then also things like, the prices dropped dramatically in 1920 during that depression. I think the Austrians would argue that was a good thing they dropped, whereas when Hoover propped prices up at the start of the Great Depression, that did a great deal of damage. I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mentioned my father's essay, The Optimal Quantity of Money, and the argument he makes there, in fact, is that the optimal behavior of the price level is a slow decline. So the argument for stable prices really is that that's the best policy that is simple enough that you have any reasonable hope of getting the government to follow it. And I think that was the argument he was making at the time. For most purposes, it doesn't really matter what happens to prices as long as people know what's going to happen, as long as you have accurate predictions. And he has an elegant theoretical argument in that essay showing that if you think about the efficient use of money itself, you want a nominal interest rate of 0, because the social cost of holding money is 0 given large numbers averaging out fluctuations. The private cost is the interest rate, and therefore you equal. But that's a complicated, neat argument. It's an elegant argument. But anyway, so no, I don't think there's any particular reason except for the fact that roughly stable prices make it easier for people to keep track of things, and that's of some value.
Did you have anything to add, Bob?
Well, yeah, let me just, I have no problem with what he just said, but again, just to clarify, because there might have been this perception that there is no real clash on the Austrians and the Chicago school. I mean, that issue of the Great Depression itself, the standard Austrian view is the reason that happened is there was a monetary inflation in the 20s, and that caused an unsustainable bubble that then popped in 29. And then that necessitated what would have been a very painful reallocation of resources. And then, unfortunately, the government didn't sit back and let that happen. That's when you had Hoover having unprecedented interventions, and then, of course, FDR. And so that's what made that readjustment take a decade, what we know as the Great Depression. In contrast, this standard Milton Friedman-esque, I don't know what your particular view is on this, and what a lot of people think of as the Chicago school explanation for the Depression was that the Fed did not inflate enough in the early 30s to offset the reduction in money because of people running on banks. And with fractional reserve banking, if people take their money out of banks, that shrinks the overall money supply. So again, that's not an ethical issue. That's clearly a strictly economic claim that the Austrians are saying the Fed inflated too much in the 20s, and that's why we had the big crash. And then the interventions prevented the reallocation, whereas the Chicago school typically would say, no, it's the Fed didn't inflate enough in the early 30s.
But note that part of that argument is that the banks had behaved as they did because they believed that the Fed would save them if there was a run, because that was what the Fed was set up to do.
Comment, I believe that Milton Friedman talked a bit about public choice and rational ignorance, but he simultaneously discussed monetarism, and he argued that the business cycle would not occur as long as people knew what the change in prices, or at least the changes in the money supply, would be. But if as an individual, because it's not going to affect you very greatly, wouldn't it make sense for you to be rationally ignorant of the change in prices and the change in money supplies? And if you are rationally ignorant of it, and if enough of the population is rationally ignorant of it, well, couldn't you still get a misallocation of resources in the Austrian business cycle? And I would like to end with KrugmanDebateMurphy.com, I believe, right?
The rational ignorance in public choice theory comes about because the individual who is well informed about who he should vote for is predicting a benefit almost none of which he gets. That when you decide to vote for Ron Paul instead of Obama, the chance that affects the outcome is unfortunately very small. If it does affect it, you share the benefit with 300 million other people. So it doesn't pay you to have that information. On the other hand, the knowledge that prices are going to go up or down in the next year is knowledge that is privately valuable to you. If you incorrectly predict that, if you make a contract where you borrow money on the assumption that you will be able to pay back the loan with money more readily available, and you don't, you privately lose as a result. If you accept a job offer because you don't realize an inflation is occurring and therefore think you're being offered high wages when you aren't, you individually lose. So what drives rational ignorance does not apply to the knowledge of the individual about what's happening in the economy that affects him and therefore is relevant to his private decisions, but does apply to the knowledge of the individual voter about things determining how he should vote. So that is why your argument, though ingenious, is mistaken.
Could you gentlemen both describe or give your opinions on the type of predictions that economics can make, the accuracy of them in terms of numerical predictions or time scales, things like that? Thanks.
Yeah, I would say that economics as it now exists is not very good at the kind of predictions that macroeconomists make and that the newspapers pay attention to. You know, there's a sense in which one of the nice things about being an economist is that you have a better answer than almost anybody else to the question, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? And this goes back to the efficient markets idea, that basically things about the economy that you can predict have already been taken into account by other economic actors. So if it's clear that housing prices are going to go down, they went down yesterday because it was clear to everybody else, so they all sold, essentially. That's a simple version of an efficient markets kind of picture. The kind of predictions I think you can make are that if you have price control at a price noticeably below the market price, there will be a shortage. If you have price control at a price noticeably above the market price, there will be a surplus. And those are predictions which you could make pretty confidently on the grounds of theory, and which we've got lots of empirical evidence to support, that the odd conditions in which those things weren't true seem to be very, very uncommon. So those kinds of predictions I think you can make pretty reliably.
Just to follow up on that, what I think the Austrian would say with the sort of predictions we make about the future involve counterfactuals. So the thing I can say with certainty is if the government increases the quantity of money, then prices will be higher than they otherwise would be. That doesn't mean in absolute terms prices will go up according to some index, because it's possible the demand to hold money goes up also. And so you could see something that we have had in the last few years in certain areas, certain time periods where the Fed's pumping in money, and the monetary base M1, M2 even could be rising, and yet the CPI might have gone down, and that's because people thought the world was ending and they're hoarding money. All right, so that's not a contradiction, and the point is, from the Misesian perspective, as far as economic theory, that you don't want to just go and start looking at boatloads of statistics to try to figure out what's the relationship between credit or monetary inflation and prices, you want to think through the logic of that theoretically and then use that to guide your analysis of history.
I hope by this time it is clear to everybody in the audience that he is attacking a straw man.
So I'm simultaneously wrong, and he agrees with everything I say.
That is to say, the Chicago method, as I explained it in the first 10 minutes, does not consist of simply looking at the data and having the data tell you the answer, because there are always an infinite number of possible models that are consistent with the same data. It consists of using economic theory to make predictions, but then testing those predictions against the real world.
Hi. I'd like maybe to find some common ground between your two positions. I think both of you agree on the very importance of theory and having a consistent theory, and that's what maybe distinguishes both of your schools from a whole lot of other economists who use lots of pseudo-mathematics and pseudo-experimental data with theories that aren't even consistent, or often a hypothesis that you find implicitly in a lot of economic papers is that government is made of superior angels above society, and that they can decide and set policies without being a part of the incentives of society. And I've read a lot of economic articles that say blah, 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 therefore the government can do that or whatever, and don't consider government as part of society. And therefore, a lot of economics is based on flawed theories, and I think you can both agree that, yes, this is flawed because the theory is flawed, their theory is bad, and I suppose that you, Dr. Friedman, would argue, well, they didn't go through all the consequences of their implicit hypothesis, which would be indeed one of your implicit hypotheses was that government is above society, therefore you should look at these consequences to make prediction and find that then experimentally your predictions are false. And maybe you, Bob Murphy, would say, oh, well, you would say essentially the same thing. You will say, these are the implicit hypotheses in these papers, and you should make... So you would insist on finding the consequences of the hypothesis, and you would insist on, hey, exposing this hypothesis as obviously false. But in the end, I think you would argue basically the same against these economic articles that say, blah, 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 we make some correlations, whatever, and then we deduce, based on this correlation, a possible government policy.
I think you are really describing the economic orthodoxy of 50 years ago. That I think that in some serious sense we won that war. That is to say, I think that serious economists at this point don't take it for granted that the government can be thought of as a benevolent, wise despot standing above the system, but if they think about the issue, realize that you have to think about the incentives of government actors too. I'm sure there are people who don't do that, but I think that if you ask sort of I don't think the public choice argument is going to be novel to anybody who is seriously doing economics.
Maybe not novel, just totally ignored.
Yeah, I mean, let me just talk about what you're saying. I think there is a sense that a lot of what Dr. Friedman and I would say in a certain issue actually would be very similar. And so maybe part of what's happening here is just the way we're categorizing what it is we're doing is different, but in practice, it's not. So just to... Caught it. Look at that. Whoa. See, when I wasn't thinking I did the right thing, but then when I wanted to brag about it, I screwed it up. So that's, what did we learn?
It was consistent with the rationality assumption, because the rationality assumption is not an assumption about how you calculate, but about what you do.
And now I've gone cross-eyed. All right. Let me just, so what he said a few minutes ago, actually I agree with wholeheartedly, and I would say that shows where I'm coming from. So when he said the thing about predictive power, and he said, oh yeah, we can predict with fairly high level of confidence that if the government sets a price control well below the market price, then that's going to lead to a shortage. And that epitomizes what I'm talking about, because what would happen, and you know that from drawing curves on a blackboard and talking through the logic of market clearing and so on. And that's how you grasp that insight and say, oh, okay, I see that thing that must be at work logically. And then in the real world, though, if the government comes and imposes, right now the market price is $10, the government comes in and imposes a market price of $7 that kicks in a month from now, and there's not a bunch of shortages, most economists, I think, are going to say, well, the demand must have fallen, or the supply curve must have increased, and so the actual market clearing price fell at the same time that Congress had these wheels in motion, and so now there actually isn't a binding price control in effect. It's not that you would throw out the theory of price controls lead to shortages. So again, it's the key thing in his phrase was to say impose a price control well below the market price, and what is the market price could be a moving target. So again, that's what I'm saying, I think what most economists think of what makes us economists and the other people non-economists is, number one, we're very arrogant and boring, but number two is that we have a whole toolbox. We've been trained to think about things in a certain way, and I would say it's more like the way philosophers walk around, that they say, oh yeah, you're talking about ethics. I've read so much about that. You're talking about, what if you were in a rowboat and this happened? We've thought about that for 100 years, and let me get you up to speed with how we're talking about that. That's what I think is happening with trained economists in the free market tradition. It's that, when someone says, well, what about the roads? We don't go and look at, historically, well, what the private provision of roads. Our first thing is to just walk through and say, well, wait a minute, the free market provides things in other areas. What's so special? But you see what I'm saying? So that's where I'm coming from, that it's what makes us good, and I think he's a great economist. What makes that happen is not because he knows the empirical literature better than you guys do. It's that he's thought about this stuff and he's very clever and has seen the way to apply certain insights in novel ways.
Hi, my question is about when it comes to predictions. Why is it that Chicago School economists seem to have failed to predict the financial crisis when a lot of Austrian economists like Peter Schiff predicted it?
I guess to give a good answer, I'd really have to look at all of the past predictions that Peter Schiff made. There's a story about George Stigler. This is one of my father's stories, that George described, I think, 3 different ways in which you can be a successful prophet. And I've forgotten one of them. But the first way is simply keep predicting something over and over again, and people will forget every time you're wrong. And then when you're right, you get credit. A slightly worse example is my Harry Brown story, which is that Harry Brown wrote a book on how you can survive the coming monetary something or other. And sure enough, the monetary thing happened, so he claims he's a winner. The only trouble is that the point of the book was that the devaluation, I think it was going to cause an economic catastrophe you had to survive, and the catastrophe never happened that he described. So his prediction was actually wrong about the important part. But George Stigler's second method was when he actually illustrated. They were going into a famous German restaurant in New York, and George said, I'll bet that I can predict the first letter of the first word the waiter says. Give me half the alphabet and we'll make a 50-50 bet. And my father wasn't willing to do that. So George said, all right, just give me one letter. All right. The letter was Y. They walk into the restaurant and George says to the waiter, do you serve beer? So that's a second way of making successful predictions. But in any case, I don't think that the question of why Chicago School people didn't predict it, I don't know if no Chicago School people predicted it, I certainly didn't, is because macroeconomics is not, in fact, a very solved theory. And it's a complicated system. We aren't very good at predicting with it any more than climatologists are very good at predicting things. Whether it is really true that if you looked at all predictions by all Austrians, you would find a high correlation between when they said something would happen and when it happened, I simply don't know. That would require data I have not looked at.
Let me just jump in on that. It's true. Sometimes they get nervous when people say, oh, the Austrians predicted this, and they'll include things in that catalog of successful, and some of it's like, quoting somebody that wants they close the gold window, saying a crisis is coming, and so one could argue, well, come on, that's a pretty big window, and so that we're not going to give them high marks for that. But as far as Peter Schiff on the crisis, if you haven't seen it, just go to YouTube and do Peter Schiff was right. And some of the stuff he said about the housing bubble is eerie as to how accurate it was. This is like in 2006, and he's saying, I don't know when it's going to hit. It's going to be whether it's this year or next year, but it's pretty scary. So Dr. Friedman's right. What you'd want to do to say, does he really have the model of the economy or a very good one, is to then go look and say, okay, he hit that one out of the park. So what I'm saying is that prediction, I think if you're going to say anybody made a good prediction, that has to count. But then you'd want to look at his whole track record and say, is that one that he got right and then missed 9 other ones? And that's an open question. I haven't looked at his predictions enough. But certainly, I think there are plenty of Austrians who were writing about the housing situation, and if you don't say that was a good prediction, then you're just going to take the sort of Fama approach and just say, in principle, nobody could possibly predict the future because markets would have already priced it in.
It occurs to me that one very simple test, if you had the data, was what happened to the wealth of Austrian economists over the last 5 years. Because if you really are good at predicting this sort of thing, you ought to be rich. In this particular case, if you make that particular prediction right, then you know that you ought to be selling housing short in some form, find some market way of doing it. Maybe there are people who did, I just don't know.
Yeah, my income went up after the crash, but that was because so many people now wanted to know, what do the Austrians think about this? So,
we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Do try and keep them brief.
So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the distinction that Austrians make between economic theory and history, because it seems like, in a way, you guys are arguing about predictions and, like just now, about like Peter Schiff. Like, technically what the Austrians call economic theory doesn't make any sort of entrepreneurial predictions. They're purely talking about analytic tools for interpreting the data that they're observing. So in that sense, like, it's not that they're making these hypotheses that they think are certainly going to come true. It's that they're saying this is not a hypothesis, this is an analytic tool for making any sort of observation, and for that reason, it's not the sort of thing that would be expected to be falsifiable.
That is, if I understand it correctly, the distinction that's being made is using economics to mean what I would call the economic theory that you use to form conjectures. And since the theory itself depends first on assumptions that are only approximately true, because people are not perfectly rational, furthermore, because you're trying to understand a system which is much too complicated to draw certain conclusions, because even if people are perfectly rational, there are lots of facts about the world, there are lots of facts about their objectives. So I would have said that it is perfectly reasonable to say here is economic theory as a logical system, but you then have to view it not as a theory for telling you what is true about the world, but as a theory for making plausible guesses about what's true about the world. And you then test those guesses against real-world data.
It's a theory for interpreting what's true of the world. Like, if the data that you have is that, say the price of milk is $3 a gallon or something like that, what you know is that that's where supply intersects with demand. You don't observe that there's a certain amount of demand and a certain amount of supply and then say, well, this matches our prediction that the price would line up with supply and demand. It's like you never observe what supply is by itself or what demand is by itself. You know that the price must be where supply intersects with demand.
Well, even that isn't quite true. You'd have to define supply and demand a little more carefully. There might be demanders who fell asleep on their way to the store or something. It's only when you fine it down enough so your statement no longer has any real-world content that you're sure it's true.
Actual demonstrated demand.
Yeah. If the price is $5, you know that at that price the amount that was bought was the same as the amount that was sold. But you knew that before you knew the price, too. Everything that's bought by one person is sold by another.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, so I don't want there to be any misconceptions. So it's true, Austrian economic theory per se does not let you become a good investor, right? That would be misunderstanding what it is. There's two anecdotes that may be apocryphal, and Joe, you correct me if these are wrong, but apparently Mises, when he proposed to his girlfriend at the time, said something like, even though I study money, I'm never going to have very much of it. And she still agreed to marry him because it's Ludwig von Mises, right? I mean, I would marry him. But
it was as though John Stuart Mill were calling.
Right. But then at the same time, apparently he turned down an offer to work at a prestigious bank in the late 20s because he said to her, no, a great crash is coming and I don't want my name associated with it in any way. All right, so again, it's, that the idea is, if what the Austrians say is that it's true, you don't get specific investment advice, but if you do understand what causes the business cycle, then you can be much better prepared to identify when, we're in an unsustainable boom right now. It doesn't mean you short the S&P next week, because it's coming. It just means that it gives you a heads up as to what may be coming.
Right. I actually can give investment advice based on Chicago School economic theory, and I've acted on it. And it's basically correct understanding of the efficient market theory, which says that if there is a company and you know something the rest of the world doesn't know about it that is important to its value, you should assume that all the other facts about it have been priced by the market, and consequently that if you know one good thing about it the rest of the world doesn't know, then the market price is too low and you should buy it, and one bad thing and you should sell it. And that is in fact coming out of theory, and the companies in question were Apple and Microsoft. Both of them a long time ago.
So I forgot to ask my gotcha question earlier. If the market was expecting the price levels not to drop, do you think QE should have been bigger than it was? And do you think that the Fed should have inflated more at the beginning of the Great Depression? Because I think that was what Milton thought, right?
He thought that the Fed should have prevented the collapse in the money supply at the beginning of the Great Depression. That is not my field. My guess is he was right. He knew a great deal more about it than I did, but it's not something I'm really competent to argue.
Bob, any thoughts?
Just to follow up on that, it's, again, not to make this about one person. I mean, right now, if you guys are familiar with Scott Sumner and his view is the reason right now we're in a slump is because, in his words, Bernanke has the tightest monetary policy since the 30s, right? So from an Austrian perspective, or some Austrians' perspective, that's crazy. Look at what Bernanke's been doing. But and Sumner is from Chicago and thinks what he's doing is the modern, the refined version of monetarism, thinking it draws on the insights of particular Milton Friedman's comments to the Bank of Japan, I think in the late 90s, as to what they ought to be doing to get out of their slump. So whether it's right or wrong, I'm just saying there certainly is a sharp difference, I think, in the economic analysis of monetary policy from what is called the Chicago School versus the Austrians.
It's the last question.
Okay. I understand and agree that fractional reserve banking in a free market is not necessarily fraud, but as it is today, there is no distinction made between the promissory notes of Federal Reserve notes when they're loaned out and Federal Reserve notes in themselves. In this case, do you believe it is fraud or not, and why?
Federal Reserve and fractional reserve banking are separate things.
Let's just say dollars instead of Federal Reserve notes.
But look, the present fractional reserve system is insane for reasons that have nothing to do with these arguments. The function of a fractional reserve system is to allow you to maintain a larger quantity of money than the quantity of your reserves in order to save the cost of mining a lot of gold. The reserves in this case are records in government books or else pieces of paper printed by the government, and the cost of producing them is essentially zero. So the current fractional reserve system is a system for economizing on the cost of producing something that costs nothing to produce. All right, it's an insane system. It's just a crazy system. It's almost a joke. But a real fractional reserve system, such as the Scottish system of the 18th century, is one in which the banks are issuing notes for 1,000 ounces of silver when they have 100 ounces of silver in their vaults. At least some of those banks, the notes explicitly said, we promise to give you an ounce of silver on demand. If we cannot fulfill this promise, we agree to give it to you 6 months later with the following premium, the so-called options clause. That wasn't fraud, nor do I see any reason why it's economically undesirable, which would be a different argument.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, just real briefly on that stuff. So I said with Rothbard, I'm not going to defend the thing, and I'm glad because, I mean, Rothbard has stuff about, you should be legally allowed to starve your child to death. So if I'm going to be defending Rothbard, this is a fairly easy one. Let me at least put what his position is, like him, Walter Block, and some others. The point was they're saying what happens in fractional reserve banking is I go to a bank and I give them, let's make it gold. So I give them 10 gold coins, and they're telling me I have that they're holding my money on demand for me, right? So it's like a sense of if I went and checked my coat at a restaurant and they gave me a ticket to retrieve my coat, that they're not viewing it as me making a loan to the bank, but no, it's a demand deposit that upon showing up I can instantly withdraw it. And then if they go loan some of that out, the idea is, well, look at then effectively the bank is telling two different people you have the property right in these same physical things sitting in the vault here, and that's where this idea of it's inherently fraudulent comes from. So, and they say you can't get around that with just noting the fact, just by saying, hey, if I promise contractually to pay you $100 for you to draw me a square circle, that's still kind of a nonsense thing, even though it was all voluntary. It's the same kind of. That's where they're coming. But again, I don't get into that because I think there's ways you could quite clearly spell out contractually exactly what it was, and then it would just be a matter of, well, no, it's not really a demand deposit, it's a short-term loan or something like that. So that's I don't think that's going to be a big deal in terms of a free society if the government weren't propping up banks and relieving them of their contractual obligations. I don't think this would be some pressing issue.
Thank you. You want to go first?
Okay, yeah, so we're just going to wrap up here. Again, let me give you the big picture here. I think as far as the Austrian school, what in the tradition of Ludwig von Mises, the thing that people really either like about it or they can't believe and they think it's unscientific is this idea that you deduce economic principles or laws from the action axiom deductively. And that was something that I didn't used to think was a big deal because I thought, well, who doubts that humans act in the sense that Mises means that term? But actually, a lot of people do, and academics do think that, like I said, extreme behaviorists and other social scientists might challenge that, number one. But also, a lot of economists will say, and we saw the views reflected here in the commentary, that that's medieval. That you're thinking of things the way that church scholars did back in the 1600s or 1500s, that we know now that to be scientific you have to use empirical methods. And I would just say look at the results of that the mainstream economics as practiced in the prestigious universities and the people that are on the President's Council of Economic Advisors, those aren't stacked with Austrians. All right? The people who've been making economic policy for the last 50, 60 years have not been Austrian economists, and they have not been slaves to the logical deductive method. They have been using what they thought were the cutting-edge results based on empirical testing of propositions and so on. And so I'm saying if we can all agree that economics as a discipline is not, it's not as well developed and prestigious as physics or chemistry, right? The public doesn't trust economists. Right, and you can grab a bunch of economists and put them on a panel, and they'll all have different explanations for what just happened, whereas you wouldn't see something that similar when it comes to physicists or chemists. There would be a lot more consensus on really important things, like what they're supposed to be doing in their role as contributing to society. All right, so you don't see that with economists. And if you think through the fields in which that's true, where it seems like there were large cul-de-sacs in the development of it, it's economics. Like a lot of people in here probably think that Keynesian economics was a huge wrong turn. In psychiatry, a lot of people say, "Oh my gosh, the whole Freudian stuff that was a mistake." Sociology, there's all kinds of stuff that I think we went into, we would all agree, oh my gosh. And so the point is, what is it about those? And I would say, well, one thing is those are all social sciences, and where they're going wrong is they're trying to use the method of the natural sciences. And it's true, in astronomy, you can't do controlled experiments. But we're not stars. We don't know what it's like to be a star. Well, I'm a star, but you know what I mean. So we don't know what it's like to be an object that emits all sorts of energy like that, right? So that's why we have no choice but to use the methods that we use in reproducible experiments when it comes to like measuring the charge in an electron. We have to use the same approach with astronomy, but we have something better. We have a much better insight when it comes to economics, and that's why we developed this body of thought. And again, the example he used there about price controls, that's a great thing that economists need to tell the general public. They need to know that. They need to know what minimum wage laws will probably do and what rent control will probably do. But strictly speaking, we're going to make a conditional claim. We're going to say if you impose this and the supply and demand don't move sufficiently such that you're now, prohibiting legally what would still be the market clearing price, then these consequences will follow. And that's a crucial thing for us to tell undergrads, that people need to know that. But we don't know that because we've studied history so much. We know it because we've thought through these things more than the average public has.
I don't think I have 5 minutes worth to say, so I'll spend the first minute defending the Middle Ages. I would like to point out that I can offer you two different examples, one from an Icelandic saga and one from a, I think, 14th century medieval Islamic traveler, of the empirical method for testing conjectures. So it is not a modern invention. With regard to our discussion, I started out saying I didn't know if it would be a debate. In my view, there are two different mistakes that different modern Austrians make, and I think Bob is only making one of them. One of them is a mistake about how to do economics, and I don't think he's making that mistake. And that's the view that you can do a priori theory and actually figure out confident conclusions about the real world, and as far as I can tell, he doesn't believe that. The other is a mistake about Chicago School economics. And that's the idea that Chicago School economics is simply blind curve fitting or something close to that. That it's just looking at the evidence and that'll tell you the answer. And as I tried to explain in my first 10 minutes, that's not the way Chicago School economists ever do economics. That the method is a method which starts out with what I think Bob wants to call all of economics, that is economic theory. But it recognizes that that theory is an imperfect description of the world and a description that doesn't tell you enough, even if true, to give certain conclusions. And it therefore uses the economic theory to form plausible conjectures about the world, some more plausible than others, but then tests them against the real world. And that's how it's really done. And I think if you listen to a recording of this talk, I hope that it will be clear the next time Bob talks about this subject that he's making no mistakes at all, but at this point it seems to me that many of his comments implicitly were attributing to the Chicago approach the idea that simply looking at the data told you the answers, and that's not what anybody believes. Thank you.
Why do we sit down when all should be standing? And why do we back down at the critical moment, like running away from the waves of the ocean? We head for the hills with the high tide approaching, as sand slips away from the castle. When it's time to stand upright, why do we falter, like placing our freedom on the sacrificial altar? We hold tight to our fears and defend our oppressors as we fight for their lives.